Greetings from Torrekula, November the 4th, 2021. See the sun, I mean t-shirt.
And look at the signs of the t-shirt. We have Da Vinci, we have Rembrandt, we have Monet, Van Gogh, Picasso, Dali, Rothko, Pollock, and Warner. Warhol. Very good. Well, with that introduction, I say thank you for coming to the lecture H640. And we will today, for the first time ever, bring up Rappaport and the Klein bottle. And it's an article of Diego Lucio Rappaport called Hyperklein Bottle, Logophysics of Ontopoiesis. It took me nearly a year to get into the writings of Rappaport. It needed some thoroughly study of a lot of subject to make it possible to penetrate the text. Well, I would start in a completely different angle. I would start with logic and the law of the excluded middle. And it's a story from the 19th century in England. The famous hymn, the psalm, 1 in 3, 3 in 1, was mostly used against Christianity, because there is something that we cannot understand there with our current image, picture, or metaphor. I don't know what expression to use, but I will later refer to that as the photograph or the central perspective. That does not allow 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. It doesn't matter how you turn it, how you model it, it doesn't go. So it turned out that the hymn was the strongest criticism against Christianity. And I think this goes to show that the picture or the metaphor, I don't have a good name for it, but the underlying gestalt of reality is determining possibilities, potentialities, but it's also telling limits, which is very obvious from this case. And now to the actual Rappaport edition, the report. Rappaport in this article is investigating that the consequences of logic and loci being the same in the Klein bottle. Locality is the same as logic. Logic and locus are coming from the same picture, underlying shape, gestalt. They share the attributes polarity, distance, opposition. You can have 2 spots in space. You can say that they are opposing. And the common term nowadays, coming from Greek, anti, has the original meaning, and it's still kept it, I think, of being opposite in space. So you can have an island named Mykonos, and on the other side you can have anti-Mykonos. Can you see here now how closely space and logic are coming from the same gestalt, so to speak, wholeness. And what Rappaport is doing, he's investigating another gestalt. And he's looking to what are the consequences if we have a completely other gestalt in the bottom. So to be very, very clear here, we have something underlying all that we are thinking, and that's containing all the potentialities, but also containing limits. And this thing is not outspoken, it's not a hypothesis. It's something more than that. But still, it limits. It's, you could say actually from a Bohmian perspective, it's implicit. But it's not only the explicit that can put limits or definitions. It's just that the implicit does it in another way. We know for a while that the Klein bottle is the most powerful tool. Here one clearly can see, perceive, experience that we can have a division between subject and object, contrary things, something positive, something negative, something in front of another thing, the anti or the un. But that they can at the very same time be the same thing. There's a simultaneity in time, but there's also simultaneity in space. So fundamentally different, but still being the same. And this is coming from space itself. And space is the primordial, fundamental thing for everything. In a certain sense, it could even be said to be before logic. The origin of logic, the source field of logic. And Rappaport goes even further and he says this is the source field of space and time. And we before been talking, for instance, from Johnson and Lakoff, that our thinking about time is taking its foundation in space. Front being in our culture, the Western culture, being the future, back being the past, and the here, which is maybe the most interesting, is the same as the now. Something that Jacques Derrida has been talking a lot about. And we earlier been touching on the figure of the central perspective. The central perspective was a revolution when it came. But one thing that's amazing, how quick it caught on. It was just a matter of decades until it completely replaced the old way of painting. And it was even so extreme that the old painting became ugly, unlikable, not logical anymore. The central perspective, what it does is to confirm implicit beliefs that we had even earlier on. It came as a confirmation. That's why it was such a success. That's why so many artists in the Renaissance said, yes, I always wanted this. I always felt this. I felt it in my heart to be the true perspective, the true Gestalt. So the model of truth comes from something that is underneath, and this underlying picture says yes to the central perspective. But what does the central perspective do? Well, it's sort of generalizing out the subject, the painter, the observer, because you have a mechanical viewpoint. Actually, I would even go so far to say, not a natural viewpoint. It's a black box, camera oscura. And a black box, it's not vision at all. But what the black box does is equals out reality. It equals out the hologram, the real world. It makes everything similar, but it takes away a lot of information. You cannot make a hologram from a photograph, but the opposite is quite possible. And this generalizing of reality, it's something that's going way back. Something that already when Brunelleschi invented the central perspective was well established since millennia, I'd say. And it's the generalizing tendency to take the subject away, the monetary thinking. It's the development of a new way of talking about vision, seeing something. What does that do? Well, it's taking away the subject. All of a sudden, the important parts are the objects. And they had to make a very strange thing, almost like the camera oscura, the machine that Brunelleschi invented or used. A camera oscura to create the objects, because they are lacking what was before. And they're generalized in a manner that is not even. It's chance. It does not do service to the original thing. It's not true to the original. It's not true at all like a hologram is true. It's not true at all like a photograph is not true about reality at all. Reality is the hologram. And this is what Rappaport is pointing to. The Klein bottle is a hologram because it's containing all of reality and it's at the same time representing it. You have the subject and you have the object in one shape. And he is very broad, Rappaport. He's incredibly broad. That was one of the reasons it was so hard to penetrate him, because I didn't have that broadness at all originally. I got a little more now, and with the help of guessing and thinking and intuition, I can get into the text. But what he wants to say, this is covering all aspects in reality. Because the central perspective, that progressed into music. It progressed into literature, poetry, administration, especially the British new administration coming after the central perspective was a success, but also type of generalization. And that helped make Britain great, but it also generalized a lot of things. The central perspective became an even like a turbo effect of the old generalizing effect, where we had like monetary units, sort of generalizing way, a gestalt for generalizing. The central perspective was even stronger. And then he went into architecture. And in architecture it became very, very strong. Could you put in a pause there just a second? Here we have a book called Wittgenstein's House by Nana Last. And it's pointing towards Wittgenstein's understanding of space. And you can read on the back cover, at the heart of his approach is the finding that philosophical concepts are at the core of his philosophy, and they are indeed special ones, including his concerns with the limits of language, the boundary between showing and saying, the intricate textual numbering systems he devised, the relationship between the interiority of the subject and the publicness of language, and the formative principle of family resemblance. Wittgenstein has as a foundation Gestalt, and I would say there is a gliding from his earlier book Tractatus, where the central perspective, I would say, is dominating still. But already in Tractatus there are tendencies which are very interesting, that sort of foretell what is going to happen in his philosophical development. And what looked like a radical turn, which was, no doubt, was already implicit spatially in the beginning, already in Tractatus. So it's like a development within Wittgenstein, and the spatialness that he already implicitly had in his body, so to speak. And the book is very interesting. It shows this transfer and how the spatiality in Tractatus worked as a segue to the later, much later, philosophical investigations. And this is also a gliding, going from the monetary, unitary generalization, universalization, the central perspective, the idea of the separatedness, complete separateness between subject and object, and then gliding all the way to the philosophical investigations, where word and world is the same thing. And there we also have a change in spatiality. It's a hologram in the philosophical investigations. The language game is without a doubt a hologram, because every part in the language game contains a little bit of the wholeness. And I particularly like the slate example when they're doing war, because inside the slate, the word slate and the object slate, it's all of the building of the wall. The workers, the way of talking, the way of moving, the way of thinking, the tonality in their voices, prosody, the environment, the ground, the material, the cement. Everything is there in the word slate, cannot be separated. And he had clearly developed a quite different gestalt, or whatever you could call it, for the world in philosophical investigations. But there was a seed already in Tractatus. And I'd say that's one of those things that influence modern life incredibly much, and that's architecture. Especially here in Sweden, we're presently filming this, where the idea of the photograph and the central perspective took a dominating position when it came to restructuring Sweden in the late 50s and going on all during the 60s, where 70% of the old buildings were turned upside down, were eradicated. Whole cities disappeared. So a lot of people ask today, when was Sweden bombed? I'm not kidding. Yes, especially maybe 20-30 years at the Tourist Bureau in Gothenburg. They often got that question because it reminded them of Rotterdam or Hamburg and those places. Places that were eradicated by Bomber Harris during the Second World War. The infamous field marshal, the infamous air marshal, sorry. Sweden was never bombed. It didn't partake in the Great War, neither in the Second World War. But what happened instead was the dominance of the central perspective that changed completely the city landscape. And it eradicated my favorite area in Stockholm. I was too young to visit Klara, for instance, but it's supposed to be one of the most beautiful parts of the whole of Scandinavia. But it was turned into cement and beton, all using the idea of the central perspective. And they were knocking on the door to even eradicate all the city part of the whole of the Nordic country, that is Gamla Stan, the old city, centrally placed in Stockholm, and it was supposed to be turned into parking house. And it's so obvious now when I start realizing the change in perspective that happened in Western civilization, going from a hologram, going from a Klein bottle, and then progressing into unitary things, universals, and then going the whole way to what happened in the end. And it is no chance, I think, that philosophical investigations already at the start sort of criticize Augustinus, who was a universalist. And on the surface, this is not the true purpose of the book. It's very clever there, Wittgenstein. On the surface, it seems it's criticism, an attack on universalism. But actually, it's not so much an attack like he trying to convey another gestalt. It's something more than an attack, much greater. And in the end, the person criticized is not so much Augustinus, because he showed that you can understand Augustinus when you take in what sort of gestalt he's using. Then it makes sense. So in the end, the only person being criticized in philosophical investigations is him. Well, turned out to be it's Wittgenstein himself. And what he is a bit hard blaming himself for his mistake. I think, in conclusion, in retrospect, he shouldn't be that tough on himself, because in a way he had the knowledge already from the start. It needed to develop, and those are one of the things that Rappaport points to. There is an enormous difference in development when you go from the gestalt of the central perspective to the more encompassing Klein bottle, because you gain all the knowledge that's been sort of generalized out in a chance-like way. The machine does great disservice to reality, and it's just to uphold the notion of that central perspective, the notion of monetary unit, that the box was used from the beginning. Not so much to develop art, became a development, but it was more to confirm what we already know about reality, that it's actually a central perspective, photograph. And this makes Rappaport's discovery so amazing, because although the initial denseness of the writing, this is an incredible tool, and it could be reformed to be usable, and it goes also hand in hand what we discovered when it comes to Bohmian project, goes hand in hand. And I had great use of Bohm. Without Bohm, I wouldn't be able to penetrate into Rappaport. That was the key that was given to me. Well, I continue later on with Rappaport, but so far it's incredibly interesting. And he opened up so many, so you get overwhelmed in the beginning. But think about this. Everything is coming from a change in gestalt, going from one view of reality to a more encompassing, more real, more giving, more knowledgeable, truer gestalt, and where the gestalt itself is participating. Because that's one big difference when I read this article. The central perspective is not participating in the same way. It's deadbeat. Doesn't do anything. It's not active. It's just like the box of Brunelleschi. Doesn't do anything. Takes away stuff automatically. Their perceiving agent is not there. There's not an embodied artist anymore. And that's actually what we shown in the beginning, something that Pollock mentioned. Both Pollock and Hockney had a big problem with the central perspective. Well, I think I round up here, and maybe we could show the beautiful lush and surroundings here on November 4th. Mölndal, a bit south of Gothenburg. This beautiful pavilion.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.